Hey everybody, thanks for joining today to Snowflake's Usage Analytics Part 1. This is a part of the Byte-Sized webinar series where you think of traditional webinars, 45 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer. Well, we're going to take a little bit different spin and we're going to do bite size. We're talking 20 to 30 minutes, somewhere in that ballpark. We know everyone's busy. It's one thing to attend a webinar live. More than likely you have to watch it recorded. So, hey, here's a little bit shorter webinar that's easier to digest. So thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have you with us. Now we're talking about Snowflake usage analytics. So real quick, datalakehouse.io, it's a platform, no code, but still allows customizing where we take your data from source all the way through analytics and everything in between. So we'll dive into that a little bit more here. So when you think of analytics, you have your different source systems. Your source systems have all of your raw transactional data. Your business has lots of questions about that individual source system. Then you start bringing in the multiple sources. Now you have questions that span across those sources. How am I going to combine that data together to get answers? So for some organizations, it's easier said than done. And really depending upon the size and complexity of your organization, putting that data into a data model, and then really building on top of that, the reporting and analytics is straightforward. And sometimes that's straightforward because of the size of the organization, maybe the lack of complexity in a source system, or just the types of business questions that are being asked. Well, in many other organizations, this is a much larger feat where it takes a significant amount of resources, which resources equals time and dollars, due to the complexity of the volume of data, the number of source systems, in the sophistication of the questions that are being asked, especially across multiple sources. So that's where Data Lakehouse comes in to take and reduce that complexity. For smaller organizations, it gives you a quicker start into visualizing your data from one or many sources. And for larger organizations, this gives you a jump start on having a starting point versus having to spend months upon months of time just to get to go from a blank piece of paper to say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Business Person, go ahead and pick this apart because we want to gather your requirements. So when you think of NetSuite and Salesforce, where you're combining data together from your CRM and your financial system to be able to say, all right, that's great that we closed an order. How well did we do on collecting revenue for that particular order? What's our profit margin for that? And so as simple as that question sounds, it actually is a bit more complex when it comes to a data perspective. Multiple sources, trying to bring that data together. Those sources weren't necessarily meant to work together from a data perspective. So that's where the analytic models and some of the machine learning that datalakehouse.io brings to the table so that you can analyze data across those multiple source systems. And of course, naturally present that information so that your business users can make better business decisions. Now, and it's all through datalakehouse.io. Now take that to, instead of NetSuite and Salesforce, you might have an acquisition. You might have a different business line or business unit that leverages some other systems and trying to bring that financial data, transactional data from your credit card transactions or point of sale systems. Easier said than done. So Data Lakehouse, we have a number of different connectors. We've got a couple dozen that are currently available to all users. And then we also have, from a roadmap perspective, another half dozen plus sources that are on target for this calendar year. Naturally, we'd love to hear from customers. Hey, which ones are they using? What business questions are they looking to answer? And then naturally, there's other source systems that we'd love to also hear about from your perspective of what's a high priority to get data from and what are those use cases that you're driving towards. Because it only takes us 2 to 3 weeks to add a new source, it's very, very quickly we can add that at least getting that data landed into Snowflake. So Snowflake is, from a back-end perspective, that is Snowflake Data Cloud. That is where all of the data is replicated into. So data lakehouse, we don't touch your data. We just move it from point A to point B, point A being your source system, such as a Salesforce, and point B, that single source of truth, the Snowflake Data Cloud. And even when data is at rest in the Snowflake Data Cloud, it's always encrypted, all times, even in flight. So let's dive into Snowflake, especially for those that might be new to Snowflake or even considering moving to Snowflake. So again, we talked about the Snowflake Data Cloud being that central data cloud repository for our data. We're ingesting that data. We can govern that data, who has access to what. And that could be either particular KPIs. It could be the different data sources. It could be level of granularity. Think from an HR perspective, HR data. All right, you don't want anybody and everybody to be able to drill down and to be able to see individual salaries. However, it would be good to see department totals for salary or averages across an organization. And naturally, from a scale perspective, because Snowflake is built in the cloud, it's a cloud-first SaaS-based application that's scaling up within a matter of seconds. You can determine, all right, I want a larger set of resources. Think from a t-shirt size, that extra small, medium, and large, that you can quickly deploy for the different workloads. But then you can also scale out. So depending upon different times of the year, perhaps different times of the month relative to your close, or a different set of business activities, you might have more users using Snowflake Data Cloud, that you can tell Snowflake to scale out when it's seeing additional workloads, and then Snowflake will scale down when those workloads have subsided. And you don't have to touch that. It's built-in inherent functionality within Snowflake. So very powerful technology in order to maximize the money that you are spending in your Snowflake Data Cloud subscription. Lots of other things that Snowflake tackles here when it comes to the data movement, whether you're ELTing in with a traditional legacy tool, you want to do CDC or even streaming of data for those real-time use cases. And also from a data transformation perspective, think of a tool such as dbt, the data build tool. It does just pure transformation tools, also a SaaS-based tool. And that data just always stays within Snowflake. Of course, building out a data lake with Apache Hive, lots of advanced capabilities within Snowflake. And naturally, at some point, you're going to want to take that data and make it available to your different user groups. Some of those user groups are going to want to see that data through a highly curated data warehouse. Other user groups are going to really want to see less curated data, but not the Uber level transactional data that was landed in Snowflake. So these different user groups, you can create the different databases for them so that they really are, their activities are separated from, say, an executive that needs to query the data warehouse in order to see updated KPIs within their organization. And naturally, you can also share the data. So file sharing within Snowflake is very, very easy. Snowflake provides the ability to let you give out reader accounts, which just allow, as the name says, to allow to read the data. So that way you don't have to go and set up SFTP servers and additional ways that make it easy for you to work with your customers, along with opening up potential avenues for optimizing and commoditizing, along with charging for access to that data. So now you've taken your data from not only an asset from an internal perspective, but now you can start charging other organizations and people to get access to it. All while keeping that separation from a security perspective and being able to track who is using the data when and for what purposes, aka how are they consuming that data. So it's great you've got access to the Snowflake Data Cloud. Well, you also want to take some time to understand what is that usage experience, that end user perspective. And there's ways that we can take proactive steps and reactive steps relative to looking at the Snowflake usage tracking. So Snowflake usage tracking, this is something that comes out of the box from a data perspective that you have access to. And this data is constantly being tracked. There's no setup that you need to do in order to enable usage tracking like many other tools require you to do so. This is done out of the box. And so every time you run a query, you load data into Snowflake, the usage tracking is getting updated. So there's a lot of very good insights that are provided. So some of those insights allow you to understand what is that end user experience. Are queries returning in a short amount of time, a long period of time? And you can look at that really, by tool, by user. So there's a lot of different ways to drill into understanding what is that experience. Leveraging usage tracking also allows you to look at, for some organizations, implementing a chargeback process or system where you can identify by department, maybe by business unit, that while you have a single Snowflake account, you can help with offsetting some of those costs by having a charge out model that based upon usage, as much as you are being charged and leveraging your Snowflake credits based upon usage / consumption as a whole, you can do the same thing for those individual units so that they pay for what they use. If they don't use it a lot, all right, that could be one level of concern to say, hey, why aren't you using it more? But if you are using it more, you may decide to do chargebacks. Some organizations don't, where it's just a Snowflake Data Cloud is for everyone to use. Let's address different use cases and becomes a centralized expense. For others, really large organizations, the chargeback model is a better fit, but using usage tracking helps enable that model. You mentioned with the chargebacks, you're able to separate the warehouses. So think of the ability, so a warehouse, going back to the t-shirt size, extra small, medium, large. Naturally, the larger that t-shirt is, aka larger that warehouse, the more costs or more credits that one will consume just because of its size. However, there may be some use cases within your organization that you want senior executive folks to have a very, very snappy experience within Snowflake, aka 1 to 2 second response time on anything and everything that their applications send SQL to Snowflake. And there's other use cases where you would say that level of speed is not necessary, so that you're able to have that user group into a different size, a smaller virtual warehouse. Again, these are all things that are done on the fly that you can configure by role within a matter of seconds and able to segregate through security as to which group of users will use which warehouse. And actually, from a data processing perspective, you could have some resource intensive processes such as a nightly or hourly or perhaps every 15-minute refresh of your data warehouse. All right, there's some additional processing power that you can put behind those functions and capabilities in order to have the data refreshed on a very up-to-date, up-to-minute process. And of course, some data scientists applications of data typically consume very large amounts of data at a single swipe, and a very complex SQL that instead of having queries run for many hours and many days, which in traditional databases you find, you can bump up the warehouse size so that those computations are running within a matter of minutes, further enabling your data scientists to move faster to help the organization to make quicker business decisions. So additional business justification for some of those future projects. So think of, could be data scientists, could be the need for someone in the organization that says, well, we would like real-time / streaming data. Okay, that's great. Let's talk about that. Here's what that means from an overall architecture perspective. While Snowflake enables streaming and real-time data consumption and getting that data into the appropriate needs, think of IoT situations. Well, there's a larger discussion that typically happens with the organization, but you can do some prototyping. You can also just leverage the scale and flexibility of Snowflake in order to help justify that. And much as users spend dollars with Snowflake, the Snowflake consumption model is really through a credit system. Yes, real dollars are attached to those credits, and you can track as you go throughout a particular calendar year. Could be on quarterly, monthly, but as you go, you're able to track on a real-time basis every single day. How are we doing against what we had budgeted, aka what we had signed up for from a subscription perspective with Snowflake? Naturally, if you're on target, that's great. If you're overspending or underspending, you're able to dig into and have conversations as to why. Overspending, you might say, oh, that's a bad thing. Well, perhaps the rollout and use cases that Snowflake is addressing within your organization have allowed more users to start consuming and interacting with the data within Snowflake. So therefore, you're spending credits faster. Okay, yes, you're spending faster. However, this is taking off like wildfire within your organization, and that's a very good thing. So you're able to identify that, have conversations to be able to say, okay, we're overspending relative to our subscription. Well, where should we be? Because there is a business case to be made in order to get additional funding. So a very good thing. And of course, you're able to see, well, how long are queries running, who's running the long running queries, and you can dig into a bit further to have real conversations with those either different application teams that are sending the queries to Snowflake, or maybe they're individual users that you can identify, and to be able to say, all right, is there a more efficient way to tune those queries? Perhaps part of that tuning is, well, let's separate you into a warehouse onto your own, so that instead of running for a very long time, it runs for a shorter period of time, and you could actually see reduced overall costs in that type of a situation. And of course, you have the ETL versus ELT dynamic as to traditional legacy tools that are picking up data, transforming that data within their system, and then pushing that data into Snowflake, versus a more modern approach of replicating the data as is from its source system into Snowflake, and then doing the transformations within Snowflake itself in order to do that in a cheaper, faster, more easy to maintain approach. So lots of reasons as to how you can use Snowflake usage tracking to make decisions. So in order to understand usage tracking, data is, or you are charged against your credits, based upon 3 different areas. So one is cloud storage, so all of your data, while it's at rest. This is a very tiny fraction of the overall cost, but there is a very small charge that goes with that. So that's part of the equation. Computation, you think of the warehouse size that we talked about earlier with that t-shirt size, that small, medium, large concept. So naturally, the larger the t-shirt size and for how long that warehouse is running and what that warehouse is doing, there's additional costs that, or I should say, there are costs that come with that. So that's another part of the overall cost calculation from consumption. And then cloud services. Naturally, as queries are running, it's consuming resources. So this is another factor that, of the 3 that fits into how credits are consumed within Snowflake. But the good thing, like I mentioned earlier, is that Snowflake provides usage tracking right out of the box, and it also includes some of the financial information relative to the subscription contract that you have signed with Snowflake. So if we go to look at, so we just come over to the left, and within Snowflake, out of the box, there's a Snowflake database, and there are some schemas that are created within your application or within your database. And again, this data, every time you run queries, this data is being written to a set of views that are only consumable by you and your account. By default, you need to have a higher level role in order to see this data, but you definitely can control who has access to this data and for what purposes are they using this data for. So let's take a look at how this data looks and what format it comes in. So these queries, because they are a view, yes, that view is only particular to your account. It does take a little bit of time to do that initial run against these queries. And I'm doing a very wide open select star. So it's not going to return immediate. If we had a more zeroed in type of a query, this would run even faster. But we see, all right, data is inserted, we have a user, but then we also have these variant columns where JSON data is stored, and saying, well, okay, JSON, all right, so I have these different keys and these different values. Well, it's nice that I have this data in here, but now I need to parse this data out so I can make sense of it, which when I say make sense of it, you can run additional queries. So there is some work that goes into this particular analyzing and trying to make sense of the data, but at least this data is here for everybody to leverage. So if we were to go ahead and run a query to parse out the information stored within the JSON column, and we want the database name, the schema, and the table to start to be able to say, all right, I have this information, and then after I have the table, I can go better understand the different queries that are run or used against that individual table. So we have a SQL statement here, and we can see where I've highlighted. This is where it parses out the JSON. So very straightforward. You're using your array-based values, 0 through X, in order to parse out the data. So when we click run, this query will essentially be executed against this access history view that we looked at earlier. And when we look at that Snowflake usage for that history, we'll see it in a moment here as to how that data is returned. We're going from that JSON and starting to make it into more of a readable format. So we have these, the different keys. You can see, all right, the first column, business key, data lakehouse key. We have a username, start time, date stamp. Great. Well, now we get into the database name, the schema, and tables, these A underscore columns, these last three to the right. All of that was split out from the JSON itself. And we're leveraging some internal functions in order to do that. So now we're able to start creating more and more queries, which is great that we're able to do that. But this isn't the most user friendly when you think of somebody in finance, or perhaps somebody in procurement trying to figure out, all right, what is that usage, or just manager type folks to understand what's being used within Snowflake, how it's being used. It's a lot to ask to create these SQL statements. They're eventually going to get very, very long and hard to digest. So that's where we come back to the presentation here and really teeing things up for part two. We're going to dive into the visualization of this data and how we can make sense of it, along with adding some special sauce from Data Lakehouse to make it even more valuable. So let's pause here for a moment. We'll ask if folks have any questions. And so with that, any questions out there? We'll see what we have in the chat window. All right, so the first question came in from Larry. When you visualize, let's see, when you're visualizing the data, what types of graphs and charts and things can I glean? Well, Larry, great question. I don't want to ignore your question, but I'd say come back for part 2, where we will talk about what information is possible from a visualization perspective and how you can get that into the hands of your users. So I don't see any other questions, so that's cool. Why don't we go on to this piece here relative to Snowflake Summit. If folks are going to the summit, we'd love to meet up with you, have coffee or more. Just to say hi, understand better about how Data Lakehouse can help you, and also just in general, hey, love to talk to you about your Snowflake journey, whether you're thinking about going to Snowflake or you've been on Snowflake for a while. Always great to hear those stories out there and just to meet various people. So feel free to ping me. The email address is here on the screen, and can't wait to see you out in Vegas here in a bit. So I mentioned that second part to this usage analytic series comes up on May 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern, so about a week from today. I mentioned we're getting into the visualization of the usage data. What is, and to be able to say, well, let's interpret some of the stories. Let's use the data to tell the stories, along with how the data is available through the open source software framework and where to go for that. So feel free to use the bit.ly URL here in order to sign up for part 2. And to give you a little bit of a teaser as to, well, when we say the visualization of the usage dashboard, so this is a little bit of your teaser as to what things will look like from a dashboard perspective, and we'll talk a bit more of what is the story being told here and how can I use this to make some better decisions from a make sure I'm maximizing the Snowflake subscription credits that I have, and just to be able to just get further insight into how your databases within Snowflake and your warehouses are being used. So we hope to see you there. Thank you for your time today. This concludes the webinar, and we'll chat soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.